Part 4 of how to improve your bioengineering projects, lessons learned from the City of Calgary Repair and Monitoring Program, is about project construction. In this presentation, we'll be covering the Repair and Monitoring Program implementation rating results, getting the right contractor, innovative construction practices, give vegetation the best start, give vegetation a head start, installation best practices, and public signage. We'll start with the discussion on construction with the results of the ratings that we developed for the Repair and Monitoring Program. As I mentioned during the previous presentation, each Repair and Monitoring Program site was given a rating for design, implementation, maintenance, success, and BRQI that were weighted into an overall score for each site. The results shown here are the average ratings for all of the sites. As you can see, implementation or construction scores were 12 out of 18, or 67%, and fell within the fair category. The overall observations that led to the score were that, in general, the structural components of the constructed works were found to be installed well. However, the implementation of the living or plant component of the projects could be improved. So in Calgary, as is probably the case elsewhere, the contractors who have the necessary skills, experience, and tools to build complicated riverbank projects are typically earthworks contractors experienced in moving large amounts of material and who have large machinery to do so. But they do not always have the necessary understanding, skills, or desire to work effectively with finicky live vegetation, and our results support this observation. So now the question is, how to get the right contractor? As most folks know, the right contractor can be the difference between a successful project and a real headache. While most repair and monitoring program sites were set up with a unit price or lowest bid contract, where there is a risk that the contractor may have no experience at all, there were a few where contractor qualifications were assessed as part of the bid evaluation. This was considered a good practice as it allowed the evaluators to assess the contractor's experience and understanding of the project, as well as price. There were also several projects that were awarded based on a pre-qualification process, where the contractors had to meet experience requirements prior to having the opportunity to bid on a lowest cost contract. Both the proposal and pre-qualification approaches seemed to result in the selection of a qualified contractor, where the lowest price tender results were variable. Some examples of contractor methods to install live cuttings are shown here. All of these approaches are essentially methods to create planting holes using hand tools such as a post pounder and rebar on the left, or a hammer drill and auger bit in the center, and then a stinger welded to a plane tamper and operated by machine on the right. All of these methods were found to be successful as long as the planting holes were deep enough and then closed off to avoid air pockets around the plants. But there was a difference in productivity, with the stinger being the fastest method, but also the largest holes to then backfill. Ultimately, the construction method must respond to the site, as sometimes hand tools are all that can be used due to site access. We documented several contractor innovations during the repair and monitoring program, including unique designs for fencing to keep wildlife from browsing on newly planted vegetation, some unique ways of creating planting holes by welding forks to an excavator bucket and using that, innovative ways of getting soil into void spaces in riprap using a telebelt system to shoot topsoil into it, the void spaces, and then remote operated solar irrigation systems. All of these helped the projects in some way to improve the construction process and productivity. With respect to giving plants the best start possible, we found mostly really good results when live cuttings were installed deeply into the riverbank and where consideration was made for getting the cuttings to soil moisture, such as making sure the cuttings have wet toes as shown in the photo here. The lower photo shows the really good establishment at the same site 6 years later when we assessed it, despite the large amount of riprap that the live cuttings were planted in. In contrast, we found high mortality in the planted vegetation when cuttings were not installed into deep soils and no consideration was made for access to soil moisture, particularly at locations with high and dry aspects. At this site, a burrito of soil was perched on riprap on a south-facing aspect, and none of the planted cuttings survived. Another aspect of giving plants the best start is to confirm that the materials used in the design were actually what is being placed on site. Sometimes the wrong matting is ordered, for example, and the new matting might not be best for vegetation growth. Additionally, making sure that soils are moist during installation and then having a system set up to irrigate the planted vegetation right for the start of the growing season will greatly improve establishment, since we found higher vegetation success with higher soil moisture. I've shown this slide during the presentation for part 2, planning, but it is worth showing it again for the construction discussion, since installing live cuttings when they are dormant will greatly increase the chances of success for a bioengineering project. Don't let the construction schedule pressure you into planting at the wrong time. It's much harder to come back and replant for dead vegetation than it is to do it right the first time. We don't need to go over the photo again, but to summarize the key points in the schedule in the table below, it's recommended to plant live cuttings harvested in spring before the third week of June, and to plant live cuttings harvested in the fall, either in that same fall after soaking or in the spring after storing in cold storage over winter. Do not use cuttings that are harvested in the spring and stored over the summer for fall planting. And then use tall rooted stock as an alternate if construction is scheduled from the third week of June to October. Now, some beneficial methods to give plants a head start. We recommend using the soil amendment with the recipe provided in the final program report. I'll also show that in a couple of slides, since we found that using a soil amendment resulted in statistically higher survivorship for planted woody vegetation, as shown in the chart on the right. We also recommend placing fencing around planting zones, since sites with fencing were also shown to have a statistically higher survivorship for planted woody vegetation, as shown in the chart here. To further show the importance of fencing to giving plants a head start, and to add a bit more detail to Pierre's discussion about this site, in the case study, the first photo shows a site that was well protected by a rodent fence for 3 years, but in the spring of 2020, the fence fell over and beavers got access to the site. They had a feast and chewed a 25-meter section of the site. In the second photo here, we observe between 3 to 6 shoots growing from each of the chewed stems. The third photo shows the site about 2 months after the first and second photos, where we measured 1.5 meters of average regrowth. So this example demonstrates the importance of protecting a site with fencing until vegetation develops a well-established root system, so 2 to 3 years of growth that can handle significant disturbance and rebound quickly. As mentioned, using a soil amendment improves vegetation survivorship. A recipe for soil amendment was included in the Calgary Bioengineering Design Guidelines that was then applied to many sites across the city. The recipe shown here is a modified version, since some of the original products are no longer available, but the main ingredients, the peat, mycorrhizae, fertilizer, and humic acid, remain the same. Some results for practices that had negative effects on vegetation establishment included soil compaction, which was measured at each of the Repair and Monitoring Program monitoring sites. We found that 78% of sites had significant compaction, which we identified as having less than 30 centimeters of uncompacted soil, and that the compaction was having an impact on vegetation growth, as shown in the chart here, where the thicker the depth of uncompacted soil, the larger the total height of the plant. We also found high mortality of live cuttings when they were planted too shallow, and container plants when the root balls were not properly covered. So it is recommended to plant vegetation according to best practices. We've documented many best practices for live cutting installation as shown here. I won't go through them all today to keep the presentation schedule on track, but they are listed here on the slide and in the Repair and Monitoring Program final program report if you'd like to go through them in detail. We've also documented many best practices for container plant installation as shown here. Again, I won't go through them all today for time considerations, but they are listed in this slide, but also in the Repair and Monitoring Program report as well. Lastly, we observed several sites with good project signage both during construction and after construction. Having construction-related educational signage at a site is considered to be a beneficial practice to provide information to the public to indicate the purpose and intended beneficial outcomes of the project, to promote greater general awareness of the importance of riparian areas, and to convey the need for the public to respect the area. So in summary, use available procurement tools to get the right contractor, use deeply planted cuttings and water them, use soil amendment and protect the site with fencing, avoid soil compaction and shallow planting, follow best practices, including recommended planting timing, tell the public about the project using signage. Now time for questions and discussion.